All right, everyone, we are back. We took a nice little break, and here we are. I think we stopped at, you said, at 1978.
Yes, 1978. Okay, so we did dancing, and the thing, as we were discussing before, that is somewhat different about the modern world from that 1970s world of theater and stage management is that once you were with a group of people, you always worked with the same group of people. And that started to happen after dancing because I got to know and work with Phil Friedman, the wonderful stage manager. He's actually one of the first to be awarded the SMA.
Del Hughes Award.
Yes, awards. And Phil and I were good friends from the 1970s through his death in, 1986 or 7, something like, must have been 1987. He died after Bob Fosse. And he, from then on, took me into almost all of the shows that he did. And the interesting thing about Phil is Phil didn't necessarily want to stay with the show. He was getting he was in his, when I met him, he must have been in his mid-50s, and we were together for more than 10 years. So, and he died, he was in his 60s, his late 60s, something like that. And he didn't want the responsibility of, he would put the show together, but he didn't necessarily want to do any of the understudy rehearsals, a lot of the stuff that stage managers do. Mm-hmm. He had done that in his past, and he left it to his assistants to do a lot of that stuff. And so he and I worked out this kind of great working relationship. And it all started on dancing. Well, dancing was very interesting because we opened, Bob Fosse had this idea of doing All That Jazz, which is pretty much based on, he wrote it with Bob Arthur, and it's based on his working on Chicago and his experiences with having a heart attack in the middle of putting together a Broadway production. And Phil is actually in the movie All That Jazz, as are many of the dancers who were in dancing when we opened. So what happened is we opened in the spring of 78, and all of a sudden Phil tells me, well, I'm leaving, like a month after the show started. First of all, the show was like a circus to run. It took, if one person was out, it took maybe 4 to 5 people to cover that person for a performance. So if 2 or 3 people were injured, the move-ups were horrifying. And the announcements before the show went on forever. I'm sure Peter von Meyerhauser talked about that or whatever. It really was like, it wasn't like anything anyone had ever done before, because it was broken up into numbers, and the covers, the swings, only basically covered people's, what would be considered their ensemble work, but they didn't cover their specialties necessarily. So other principals who were in the show moved up, but they had to be covered not only in their specialties, but their ensemble. It was like the move-ups were so nasty. Phil was not having any of this. So he said, I'm going off to do all that jazz. I turn this over to you. You can do it. I'll come back and do the LA version, which was coming up, I think, later that summer. But he went off to do the movie of all that jazz. And Bob had immediately grabbed up Annie Reinking, Sandal Bergman, Vicki Fredericks, all of the great dancers from dancing, and wanted them to be in the movie. So we immediately had to, it wasn't like any other show you've ever worked on. We had to immediately replace major people in major slots in a show right after the show opened. So I was very fortunate to have with me Gwen Verdon and Catherine Dobie. And Catherine Dobie had been with Bob since Little Me she was in. And she had been his assistant probably since, I don't know, sometime in the 1960s or 70s. And knew his style and work backwards and forwards, as did Gwen. And we immediately set up auditions. And we were like plugging holes left and right in a show that was so wildly complicated. So we were rehearsing all the time, on top of doing the Tony Awards and, all the stuff you do when you open a show, and stealing people away to do a movie. So things got really hysterical over at the theater. So I immediately moved up to the production stage manager position. Phil took off to do the movie, but Phil and I had become good buddies at that point, and he went off and did the Los Angeles production of Dancing, which Gwen Verdon and Chris Chadman put together out there. And Phil went out and started that. And then Phil was replaced and he came back. But he went on to do shows with someone else that he had worked with on Pippin, Stuart Ostro, the producer. So Phil, once I had reached 2 years in dancing, which was my limit that I basically ever stayed at a show. I think dancing was the longest I ever stayed. Pretty much the longest I've ever stayed with a show was dancing. I stayed 2 years. And then I left, and Phil and I went off and did one flop after another for Stuart Ostro, who was this wonderful producer. He put together, we did Mooney Shapiro's Songbook. We did a show called Swing, which closed out of town. We did, and I'm telling you, every time you work on a flop, you get these great relationships with all these people, but either the show closed out of town or it closed on opening night. I did American Passion for Stuart Ostro, where I was the PSM from the beginning. And it really just was a very kind of hectic and joyous time, but weird, because you'd rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, and shows would close. Like, we were the last show to play the Morosco Theater, which was torn down, which is one of the very famous theaters on 45th Street. There was the Bijou, the Morosco, and the Helen Hayes was on the 46th Street side. And those three theaters were destroyed to build the Marriott Hotel and the Minskoff Theater. That was that great, that terrible time, which ended up not being so terrible. The one theater that was really worth saving was the Morosco, which was a brilliant theater where Death of a Salesman played. All these famous shows played at the Morosco. And it really was terrific. But we were the last show to play that theater, and we closed on opening night. And it was like, you'd go and you'd rehearse, you'd do all this hard work, you'd do everything. But when a show closes on opening night, you come in, especially if it's a Sunday, you come in on Monday, you do the loadout, and then you're out of work. So it got to be a period of people had to scramble to find work. And the 1980s were not the most productive time in large-scale musical theater. And that's basically what I was trained to do, was large-scale musical theater. I had done one or two what I call kitchen sink dramas to fill in the time between, and I swore I would never do them again. Those are those things that, it's basically the set is a living room and a kitchen with running water. Mm-hmm. And you have to worry about, is the water really going to run and is the sink really going to drain, more than anything else, because the shows were, other than handling the usual stage manager functions, that was basically the extent of it. I basically was more at home with singing and dancing and acting, big musical time, and working with choreographer directors. So the 1980s, and then, of course, what happens? But the AIDS epidemic strikes, and people were all of a sudden dying. And it was a time of great sadness and in the industry, I felt. And if you could connect with a group of people that you really enjoyed being with, you really wanted to hang in there. So I hung in with Phil, but then through Chris Chadman, I went on to meet Tom Ian. Now, Chris Chadman was a dancer in Danson. After Danson, he became a choreographer and did the famous Jerry Zaks production of Guys and Dolls. And he choreographed a lot of shows. And in 1983, I think it was December of 82, he was working with Tom Ian on a show called Kicks. And they asked me to come to Tom's house and listen to this score. And it was Alan Menken and Tom Ian. And Chris wasn't there, and they played the score for me. And I said, well, this is fabulous. I've got to do this. This is unbelievable. Well, we worked on Kicks from 1983 till 1986. We did more workshops. We did, I don't know how many workshops, readings. I was like the king of the workshop. In fact, I was brought in by the union to discuss how to really negotiate. That's when I really got involved with Actors Equity, because we had so many discussions about what was happening with the world, because starting with Michael Bennett in 75 with Chorus Line, that was the beginning of the workshop era, basically. And the computer era. Mm-hmm. And it all kind of happened at once. And so I hung in there with Kicks for 3 years, doing all these incredible workshops, meeting all these great people, and making basically no money. And the show ended up not happening after 3 years of work. No. And finally, Fosse called again, because he really didn't do a show between Dancing and Big Deal. So that was I guess the end of 85, we started on Big Deal. And he called me back to do that. And he said, Perry, you have a choice. You can do the new show, Big Deal, which is based on Big Deal on Madonna Street, or you can do Sweet Charity Revival with Debbie Allen. And I said, oh, well, I want to do the new show. I don't want to do, I loved Sweet Charity. I saw it, when I was 15 or 16 years old, the original production, and loved it, but I really wanted to do the new show. Now, the new show was the beginning of the moving light era. This was one of the first shows to actually take moving lights and make them dance. And it was the beginning of computer-operated scenery also. So we had the double whammy of anytime you do something that's on the cutting edge, which Fosse always was on the cutting edge, it's hair-raising because things don't work the way you think they're going to work. Sure, 5 years later, 10 years later, it was all perfected, and now, we've done other shows where moving lights are like nothing. Someone comes in and programs and does it, and it works like a dream, and it's never, if you focus it right and people maintain it beautifully, then you never have a problem. But back then, they wiggled, they jiggled, they did all sorts of crazy things. And Bob was also into his movie phase. So he had done all that Jazz and Money and what was that other movie about the Star 80 and all of this stuff. So he was into he wanted to do Big Deal like it was a movie on stage. So what Phil and I had to do was Phil took the backstage computer and he was on stage, and I took the lighting end of the show, and I was in the follow spot booth, and we had two people calling the show at the same time. And it was one of the first show with usually shows back then, maybe they had 225, 250 light cues. Well, Big Deal had over 500 light cues. And the show wasn't that long. It wasn't like, oh, this was a 4-hour extravaganza. This was a regular, the first act was maybe, 55 minutes, and the second act was a little bit longer, was an hour and 5 minutes or something like that. And there were 550 light cues. So you couldn't possibly move the scenery and call the lights and call the projector. There was a lot of projector stuff, and not kill people all at the same time, because things happened in Big Deal, like the floor opened up and a slide came out of the floor and the actors had to slide down, and there had to be all these stage managers. We hired, I think I was up in the booth, Randy was over there, Phil was over there. There were at least 4 or 5 of us, because there needed to be all these people. There needed to be at least 3 people on the deck. Now, the advantage of me calling the show is I could watch the show and take notes and do the understudy rehearsal and do all of that stuff after the show opened. But it was a monster show, and it didn't run very long. It ran a few months, and it closed sometime after the Tony Awards. where Bob again won the best choreography, but the show was not a big hit. And right after that, I get a call from Tyler Gatchell. The guys over at Song and Dance are leaving to do Les Mis. And I want to know if you're interested in taking over Song and Dance. And the one thing that I was not so keen on was taking over shows. That never really it may have interested me at the very beginning of my career, but we were already in the mid to late 1980s. It was like 1986. And I wasn't really interested in taking over Broadway shows, but Song and Dance was that perfect mix for me of the first act was a heavy-duty dramatic musical with Bernadette Peters, and then Betty Buckley took it over. And the second act was dance. It was all dance, choreographed by Peter Martins and wonderfully put together by Richard Maltby. And Tyler said to me, would you do this for us? So I went in there and I worked like a fiend because I had to learn this really fast because those guys wanted to get out of there and go and do Les Mis. And I'll be kind about this. They weren't particularly helpful about it. Mm. And they turned, I had done dancing and a lot of heavy-duty dance. And the way they put together the dance section of the show was in a way that I was particularly not comfortable. I do read music. I do all of that because at the Joffrey you had to read music and do all of that kind of stage manager stuff. But they did the whole second act off the score. They moved the scenery, which was somewhat substantial in that show for a show that played the Royale, which I think is like the Schoenfeld these days. And there were lots of light cues, as a big dance piece would be. But they did it on the score. And the one thing you learn in dance is that it's fine to do certain things on the score, off the score, but to call a show where things are moving and you have dancers dancing off a score is not very organic for anybody. And I discovered that when I was learning the show, I was like, guys, you missed that cue because the dancer, while they were dancing to the music, you need to be following them because a lot of the stuff happens on movement, not just off the music. If they're like moving through space and they're in a certain place, the light needs to move with them. You learn that, that's in dance. It has to be organic. It has to flow with the people that are on the stage. It's not like doing a dramatic piece where when somebody sings and you build a number and you button the number and it all happens on the music with the performers and you're never really off and all of that. When you do dance, it's a very different psychology of how you stage manage something and how you put it together. And I went back to Jules Fisher and I said, Jules, who was the lighting designer, I said, Jules, this is like, things are like off here. they're not on because everybody is so busy doing stuff off a score, they're not really paying attention to what's happening on the stage. They're reading the score, they could see partial stage, and they had video monitors, but they were mainly doing it off the score. And we did fixes, and I had worked, Jules was the lighting designer on Dancing, so I knew him really well, so I could go to him and say, listen, this is not my idea of a good time. In terms of taking, I feel not very comfortable coming in and taking over somebody's show that they put together. And at least for the dance part of it, I felt uncomfortable because I felt that people needed to be better about how they protected the show and protected the performers and maintained the performance. And luckily, in the middle of all of that, Bernadette Peters' contract was up. And she was lovely, lovely, lovely. And Betty Buckley came in. And we got a chance to rethink the show. Richard Maltby came back. Peter Martins did not come back, but I had Cynthia Onrubia with me, who was his assistant and the dance captain, Peter Martins' assistant and dance captain for the show. Because the second act really was all dance. And we got to reinvestigate a lot of the dance section of the show and figure out what we should be looking at and looking for to make this work in a better way. And that was really interesting and exciting, and it ended up being such a wonderful experience. And it went so smoothly. Unfortunately, the show was at the end of its run, and Tyler came to me and said, listen, this show is ending, you know, I think it was like September or October, they were going to pull the plug on it. And would you be interested in something right up your alley, really, really big? I want you to go to London, take a look at this. And it again, Song and Dance was written by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And go to London, take a look, see what you think, come back to me and let's talk. So they sent me to London, and the show was Starlight Express. So I went to London and saw the show, and I thought, boy, this show is pretty neat in terms of what a stage manager has to do. It was brilliantly staged in London by Trevor Nunn, and the musical numbers were done by Arlene Phillips, the fabulous Arlene Phillips. And I came back and I said, oh, I definitely want to do this. I definitely want to do this. And they said to me, well, here's the one drawback. Frank Hartenstein is going to open the show. Now, Frank isn't going to stay with the show, but I want you to be there so that when this show opens and Frank goes back to the Dodgers, you're going to take this over immediately. And Frank, we loved Frank, and he did a great job of putting this all together initially, but he didn't enjoy doing the show very much. So he left right away, and I took over the show immediately when it opened on Broadway, like the first month or two after it opened. And we got the show down to a science. And it was very thrilling because it was one of those Andrew Lloyd Webber shows after Cats where it brought a lot of young people into the theater. And young kids just thought dancing on roller skates was the end. Now, rehearsing on roller skates was not so much fun, especially for the performers. And we had a lot of trouble figuring out the logistics of how to really do this in New York, given the limitations of the contracts and how different London equity is from American equity. And we basically went to the union and again kind of worked through all of our issues of skates and doing skate warm-up. Instead of a fight rehearsal, you had skate warm-up every day, getting all the machinery, the bridges to work, all of the stuff that was involved in Starlight Express, having race rehearsals instead of dance rehearsals. It was a very complicated show, but in a certain way, it was not that hard to run. The one problem we had was with, the computers always worked beautifully, but they were sometimes affected by, like early computer work, sometimes if there was like a storm, a lightning storm, there could be a glitch and a computer could take off and you had to be ready to stop things. Or in Starlight, you were dealing with races. So different people were in different places on the stage. So you had to be out in the house. We were up in the follow spot booth. And you had to follow people all around. And it was a really interesting, wonderful show to call. It was a stage manager's dream in terms of that. Now, in terms of rehearsal, it was kind of a stage manager's nightmare because you had to really get people in there. They had to be trained not only in their songs and dances and scenes, but to roller skate and to race and to be fierce and to be unafraid of all the machinery and what could possibly go wrong and happen to them. So luckily, I had the greatest group of assistants with me to do this. It was a remarkable experience. And Michael Pissarro started as a production assistant on the show. And Mikey is now a very highly respected stage manager on Broadway and works all the time. And he immediately moved up, and I had Randy Whitescarver, who's now Randall White, and he was on the show, and Bonnie Panson and Clayton Phillips and a host of we had like 5 stage managers, because there had to be people all over the theater, including the basement in the trap area, because we had elevators that went up and down, and you name it, we had it. We had bowls that rose out of the floor. We had bridges that zoomed around the theater. A bridge went up and down in the house. They skated through the house. They skated everywhere. And it was a great experience. Now, what was also great about doing Starlight is it gave us a chance when we put together the national tour, because the producers, it played for, I think, 2 years on Broadway, and I stayed with it for most of the run. I left a few months before it's ended. But we were putting together the national tour. Now, how do you put together a national tour of something that was totally built into a theater? I mean, it took months of load-in to put Starlight into the Gershwin Theater. Months, because of all of the machinery. And we went off to London to have a discussion with the set designer and Arlene Phillips, the choreographer, who was going to move up to the director spot and stage the numbers and direct the show. And how do we put this monster into theaters, make it move around the country, have it make money for the producers and the backers, and not kill everybody all at the same time? Well, we knew it had to do something with movies. And no one could figure out how that was going to work. And Tyler was with me, and we were in a taxi cab going from London back to the airport to Heathrow in a black cab. And I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was a billboard, and the billboard had miniature periactoi, and it spun so that it had like 3 sides, like old-fashioned periactoi. Mm-hmm. And what it did was it changed the sign, the advertising changed. And I said to Tyler, that's the answer to it. I said, you could do a plain backing on one side, because it gave us 3 options. You could do a really advanced movie screen on another side, and you could do something else. And what was that something else? Oh, it was black backing for any time we needed to go into a black surround kind of thing, which we had to for the Starlight number. And I said, that's your answer. And we immediately got to the director, got to the designers, went back to London, said, this is what you need to do. Think about how you would do a movie of all the races so that we didn't have to go into the floor, that we didn't have to have bridges. We still had to have the bowls that came up and down, but they could be part of a modular set. But have the races start live. The musical numbers would be done live, but the actual race would be filmed. Now, to film the races, because you had understudies and all of that, you didn't want to be changing the film all the time. And luckily, Starlight is costumed so that everybody, except when they're doing their musical numbers, in the races, is wearing a helmet, which totally covered their face. So we were very, very lucky. And we kept that design. We kept basically the Broadway costumes. It was reconceived to be totally modular, totally could move. We could load it in over the weekend. You know, we could do our Sunday shows. Monday, they could load it in, and they could literally open, at least in the second or third city, by Tuesday night. And it was all based on the idea, the premise that it was going to be done with film, that you would incorporate the film, kind of like a World's Fair kind of film. And they let us, and Randy Weiscarver was so brilliant. He and a group of he had learned to skate. He was my assistant on Broadway. He was the first assistant. and he had learned to skate, and he and the skate coach and myself came over from America, went on to the set of the London production, and sketched out with Arlene Phillips what the races would look like on film. And we came up with this mock film. We did it with video, and I was basically the cameraman for this mock. And so we went into the London theater, and they skated around, and we said, we did race 1, race 2, race 3, race 4, and we did a mock-up. And we then could bring it back and hired a film producer, a video guy, who would do a film for us, produce it in New York, build sets that were kind of Wizard of Oz-like. They designed these sets, they built the sets, and they filmed it with the cast in New York. And it was all done in this big studio in New York. And we took it out on the road, and it was a huge hit. The show was a big hit on the road and made back, because I don't think it ever recouped its money in New York. Even though it played for close to 2 years, it never recouped all the money. And we had huge houses, and it was in the largest theater at the time. But on the road, we could play these big barns, because the bigger the better for that show, and have the film do the work of the races, but have the actors do the actual body of the show and not get hurt quite as much. So it really was a win-win-win on every aspect of it. And it was fabulous. And everyone was really, really pleased. So after that, Tyler Gatchell says to me, well, there's this new show in London that Andrew is writing called Aspects of Love. It was done in Sydmonton. It just opened in London, directed again by Trevor Nunn, who at that point I knew really, very well, and we got along terrifically. And go to London, take a look, see what you think. And I called him from London and I said, oh yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. This show was all on treadmills, and it was one of these big monster shows in a medium-sized theater. It wasn't in one of the large, it wasn't a blowout in terms of a large theater, but it was very dangerous because the treadmills could eat you alive, because they did eat one of the actors alive in London. So when they came to New York, they put in all these provisions to stop the action of the treadmills. Now that became more dangerous, of course, than actually the danger of having the treadmills not have these stops. But we got over it, and it was not the easiest show to do, and it ran about 1.5 years, and it was a challenge. It was a great challenge. Now, right at that time, I got a call from Susan Schulman, who said to me, listen, someone you know is not well and is stage managing My Sweeney Todd up at the York Theatre. Would you consider doing this? I know it's not, you're used to working with Bob Fosse and all these people, but would you consider doing this? And I said, well, let me take another listen to Sweeney Todd, the CD, and I took a listen and I called her back and I said, yeah, this is a great show. This is a really great show. The poor stage manager who ended up being my assistant on it after it moved, we did it at York, and this was the somewhat famous Teeny Todd that was done in the gymnasium at York Theatre with the wonderful, wonderful Susan Schulman directing. And we had condensed the show down. We worked on it. It was a dream. It was a dream. Sondheim came in. He was fabulous. He worked with the cast for a day. Susan did a brilliant job of staging it with Michael, the guy who did the musical numbers, and we just had the best time. And that moved to Broadway, and that was being done around the same time as the Starlight Tour, Aspects of Love. So I was like working on that, and then we moved that to Broadway. And while we were doing that, Tyler says to me, well, Andrew has this idea that he wants to do a retrospective of his music. Let's go to Vancouver. This is a one-shot proposition. We'll get the best singers around. Let's get Sarah Brightman, who had left Phantom and she was married to Andrew at the time. And let's do the music of Andrew Lloyd Webber. So we went and did it, and it was this phenomenon. So we brought it back to New York, and we brought it out on the road again. We kind of condensed it down a little because it was the version that we did in Vancouver and Chicago was this monumental orchestra. It was like a 70-piece orchestra. And they were on stage with us. And it was really wild putting this into these big monster theaters in Vancouver, Toronto, and Chicago. So we kind of shrunk it down and we sent it out on the road. And at that point, I put it out and then brought in people to take it over because I couldn't. It was like I was overwhelmed. There were just too many things all happening at the same time. And I had to leave Sweeney Todd, which was somewhat simultaneous to this. After the opening, I got in all the understudies. I ran the show till opening. I opened the show. I put in, my assistant came back and assisted me. He took it over, and because I got a call from, do I have this right? From George Wolfe? No, I don't have this right. I have this wrong. Yes, I do have it right. To do Angels in America. He said, Angels in America is like a big musical, only it's a straight play, but it's like a 3-act musical. It's like non-stop scenery moving around. Robin Wagner doing the sets and Jules doing the lighting, and it's this incredible piece. So they sent me home with a script, and I said, oh, gotta do this. This is like, can't not do this. This is too good to be true. So went off and we shoehorned, I don't know how we got it into that theater, but we shoehorned Angels in America into the theater. Luckily, when I did Millennium the first show, and Perestroika, the second show, I supervised, but my assistant on the first show was Mary Klinger, who had done Angels in California. So she knew the show better than I did in terms of the whole piece. I mean, I knew the first show really well because I had put it together, but she knew the second show, and I was like, okay, yeah, I know it, but I'm only gonna be there if you need me. And she took it over and she did a brilliant job, and it was, I don't know how they survived for almost 2 years loading out. Luckily, Millennium Approaches only ran, it ran from the spring to the fall, and then they started rehearsing the second piece, and they put Perestroika in the fall of that year. And the changeovers were so monstrous. It was incredible. I don't know how they did it and survived the whole situation, and the stagehands, and we had trucks on the street and scenery on the street, and the first play had so much scenery that we had to get it out of the theater so that we could put the scenery for the second show in, and they were playing in rep, and it was like, oh my God, this is like, you might as well be doing opera, at the old Met, in the little tiny Walter Kerr Theater. And I took off and started doing, I think it was the Red Shoes came after that. And I was slowly burning out. Oh, and in my spare time, they came to me with a little project called Encores that Judith Dakin, which harkens back to my Paul Taylor days and my Joffrey days, was putting together over at City Center. And they said, how about if we do these very large concerts with full orchestras, but actors with scripts on stage at City Center of American musicals that haven't been produced in a long time, haven't been revived, or are very hard to revive for whatever reason, but do them in the way that they were originally meant to be done, with the original orchestrations and the original book, basically. Sometimes the book was cut down, and we worked on that and came up with the Encore series. And I did the first Encores, which was Fiorello. And then Susan Schulman and I, from Sweeney Todd, did Allegro. And then I did Du Barry Was a Lady. And I did, which I think was the second year or third year, and I did, it was Allegro and Pal Joey with Patti LuPone. And it was wonderful. We had the best time doing this. But it was at the point where I was going off to do other things, and Susan and I ended up doing Secret Garden in that time, and we ended up doing something called The Red Shoes. And The Red Shoes was an interesting piece. It was Julie Stein's last Broadway show. And we did a workshop up in Saratoga of it. And then we did the rehearsals. We did a workshop in New York of it. And then all of a sudden, when we were going to go into production, Susan got fired for whatever reason. That was all very strange. And they called in Stanley Donen, who was the famous movie director, to take her place. And at first, we all hit it off. And then I could see things were not going too well. And Stanley was really a movie director and a fabulous movie director. And I was trying to help him through the craziness of putting together this monstrous physical production, which was quite beautiful, actually. Heidi Landesman put it together. Heidi Ettinger put it together, and she did a really extraordinary job. And finally, we came to somewhat of an impasse. And towards the end of the rehearsal period in the studio, I was fired. Because we just didn't get along. Things just didn't work out. And that had never happened to me. And it's an interesting thing when you're fired for very weird reasons. All of a sudden, it only happened twice. It happened on that show, and then it happened again on Saturday Night Fever, which I was with for a long time, and then was fired for something that I was accused of doing that I had not done, because the producer got it into his head that the actors weren't bright enough to have pulled this off. But the actors on that show were very bright and really wonderful, and they had complaints with how the show was how they were being represented in the show. And they went to the union with them. And they accused me of basically instigating this. And I didn't really, other than saying, you have to be very careful about how you do this, I really stepped back from it. And the producer blamed me for not keeping them all in check. And I was let go of that show. And I thought, oh, this is very interesting. And I went to the union and negotiated a really good, they had to buy me out, is what they had to do, because they couldn't come up with any good reason to fire me. There was no just cause. And just cause had just been put in the contract at that point. And the union backed me up 100%, 150%, I would say. And they got me this incredible buyout, and they had to pay me for the next 9 months of the run, basically till the show closed, pretty much. And other than that, it was a very happy experience. Other than that one little glitch in it, it was, Arlene Phillips from Starlight and Robin Wagner again, and all those great people, and a splendid cast. And we had the best time in the theater, and a British producer who just didn't get where we were coming from. So I left that, and then I did another show with Tom Ian, and Bobby Longbottom was putting together something called Sideshow. And he and Henry Krieger, who I had worked with Henry on the Tom Ian days, we had done something called Dangerous Music down in Florida at the Burt Reynolds Theater, which was supposed to come to New York, but never did, and had this all-star cast down in at Burt Reynolds, Donna Murphy and Laurie Beachman and all these great people. And so Henry went to Bobby and said, you guys belong together, let's do Sideshow. And Sideshow was a great experience, loved it. Great cast, great, everybody got along really well. We did an extraordinary workshop. We did a few workshops, but the really extraordinary workshop is when we went back to the old way of doing pre-Broadway, which was that you went, from my Fosse days, what we did was, before we went out of town, we brought the show with all the props and all of the mock-up scenery into an empty theater, rehearsed in an empty theater on Broadway, and performed it for a gypsy run-through. And that's what we did for Sideshow. We rehearsed in the Brooks Atkinson Theater, and then we brought everything over to the Richard Rodgers, and we did the whole workshop on stage at the Richard Rodgers. It was this huge sensation. After the workshop, they decided immediately to move it to Broadway, which possibly was a mistake. They maybe should have waited till the springtime. And we got very good reviews. It was a dream to work on, except that we couldn't, for some reason, get an audience. It was a very strange show. It just didn't, for some reason, in the dead of winter, nobody wanted to see a show about Siamese twins. And it just didn't. It ran a few months and then it closed. And then I stayed with Bobby, and we did a few other shows, a production of Marty in workshop, and then we did Flower Drum Song. And we did readings and workshops and readings. And finally it was picked up by the Center Theater Group in California. That wonderful producer, what was his name, out in California, and brought out there, and we did it. And that was also a terrific experience. And came back to New York with it. And it was such a great experience. And we put together a really terrific national tour of it. The show didn't run particularly a long time, but it spawned this national company that what we did was, we did this very strange thing. We kind of went to cities, played for 4 weeks, came back to New York, and had time off, and then we would go out and play another 3 or 4 weeks, came back to New York, and then we would go out and play another 3 or 4 weeks. And that's when I decided I basically didn't want to be in the theater 8 shows a week anymore. And the thing that was happening was, between all these workshops and readings and everything, from 1999 to 2003, I was working as a consultant for Merrill Lynch. And they made me an offer in 2003 that I couldn't refuse. And I said to myself, listen, I don't see any bright future for me anymore in the theater. I love the theater. I love going to the theater. I love putting the shows together. I love doing all the things to get it up and running and through the Tony Awards and the recordings and all of that stuff that you do. But I didn't really want to be in the theater 8 times a week for the rest of my life. And I was in my mid-50s, I guess. And they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And I just said, listen, I'm going to take this. And I really thought long and hard about it. And I had enough of that life, at least for now. So I took it and I stayed with Merrill Lynch for 13 and a half years and went off to London every January to see shows. Sometimes we would go, because I had a very good deal at Merrill Lynch. I could take vacations anytime I wanted. The thing was I couldn't take more than 10 days off at a spread. 5 days, which was basically 2 weeks, 5 days and then 5 days of Monday through Friday. But I could go to London in January and see shows and come back and go back to work for Merrill Lynch and go in, like September we would sometimes go for a long weekend and see some shows. And that was enough for me. And I had had such a good experience with so many great people in this business, and made so many friends, and worked with just the best people you can imagine, and really, really enjoyed every minute of it. But the nuts and bolts of being in a theater day in and day out, once the understudies were set, that was not something I really wanted to continue. You know, I kind of understood where Phil was coming from, where he said, Perry, you take all the understudy roles, because I don't want to know about it. It's like, I was at kind of the same age he was when he stopped doing that. You know, and I thought, I had seen so many people come and go, and it was also a time when a lot of people were not with us anymore. Tyler Gatchell had died, and Fosse had died, and Phil had died, and so many of the performers were taken out with AIDS. And I thought, listen, it's time to really take care of yourself and make sure that your life is, that you're really happy with what you do. So I stayed with Merrill Lynch all those years and just retired in July, and have been very supportive of Actors Equity and through the years, and did many production contract negotiations as a stage manager. And I just called them last week and said, listen, next year when you start looking at the production contract for Broadway, put me back on the production contract committee, and I'll be there for you, because you guys were there for me when I needed you. And that's basically where the story ends. Now I'm a happy retired person, and people say, do you like retirement? I love it. Now I can travel and do things and not have to work 6 days a week or 5 days a week or 8 performances a week. And sure, I would love to rehearse a show and do, and would consider it if it were the right opportunity. But I'm happy doing what I'm doing right now. And I think that's my story.
I'm just listening to all of this amazing stuff that you did and the time that you were working 3 contracts and doing 8 million things, what would your advice to younger stage managers be to not burn out in this business?
to not burn out? Well, first of all, take care of yourself. Make sure that you get enough sleep and enough, just take care of your health, because no one else is going to take care of it for you but yourself. Make sure that you're doing. I had a really weird philosophy of doing shows. And one of the reasons why I was so happy doing what I was doing for the time that I was doing it, because I really loved it more than you'll ever know, was I basically was very fortunate in that I got to choose 95% of the time the things that I wanted to do. And when you choose the things you want to do, it's a very different mindset than when you do it and it's just a job. When you love it that much, when you can sit there and read a script of Angels in America and say, I've got to do this, then you make every effort to get out there and do it. And the way you don't burn out also is to hire great assistants. You hire the best people to work with you. And to be aware, to sniff out kind of problems before they arise and anticipate things. Anticipation is one of the great saviors of a person in this business, is if you can anticipate things. It makes your life and everybody's life in the theater so much easier, because theater is like, it's this strange thing. When you're putting together a show, because so much of what I did was production of new material. I was not known for taking over shows, as I said. I was not known for doing dramas, except for the one or two kitchen sink dramas, and Angels in America, which was really like a big musical. But when you can get in there and kind of work your way through it and learn from one experience to the next and grow with it, and take what you've learned from when you were 20 years old and apply it to what happens when you're 50 years old, that's the way you survive it. You really try to make it a happy, family-like experience anytime you do a show. And there were one or two that were not so happy experiences. Not many of them. There's one in particular, I'm actually looking at the poster right now, which was a wonderful experience, but it was a very stressful experience. And it involved, it was a show that maybe the theater that was doing it shouldn't have done, because it was over their heads in terms of the scale of the show. But I wanted to do the show so badly because it was an old Fosse piece. It was huge when it was done originally. I did the revival of it, and it was huge in the revival. And because they couldn't afford to do the physical production the way we had originally envisioned it in our minds, it didn't work physically. It couldn't work. So what we had to do was, after many, many all-nighters, this was one of the few shows that I felt like, oh my God, I am back in college. I'm back at Temple. And this was around, I think it was something like 1990 I did this show. And it wasn't going to work the way we had envisioned, because the turntable, it was a computer operated show, and the doors operated the turntable, and the turntable operated the doors and the sliders, and the turntable was never built to spec so that it never properly triggered any of the other pieces. The doors always triggered the turntable, but the turntable never fed back to the doors properly. So what we had to do, to make it a long story really short, is I had to pull the show apart in tech rehearsals and re-tech the show after many all-nighters, and actually getting through. Thank God we had a brilliant director, Rob Marshall. Brilliant guy. And this is before he went off and did Chicago movie. And I re-teched the show without the performers in the evening with the stagehands in this theater, and pulled apart everything that was operated by the computer. Now, the computer could operate the individual sliders and doors and turntable, but it couldn't trigger them. So I literally had to pull apart all the cues. This was I just had to make a lot of work for myself. Things didn't trigger other things the way we had envisioned, but we wanted it to look the same as if they did. So we would open the doors, the turntable would start, it would bring the cast on with the scenery, it would move the scenery into position, it would close the door behind it and not kill anybody. And then when the turntable took off, when it reached a certain place, I manually opened up the other set of doors on the other side. They whisked through. It was supposed to happen like magic, but we pulled it apart cue by cue by cue, because I had done so many all-nighters that I knew how this was going to work, and I knew exactly how to make this work. And we had made it work on Secret Garden because we had a great turntable, and we had a great set of sliders, and we had a great shop build the scenery. So I knew how this was supposed to work. But I pulled it all apart and did it cue, and we filled in with the light cues, and we made it work. And it wasn't a problem, but it was a scary show to do. In that it just, until we could make the turntable behave, which it never did till the closing, the last performance. I stayed with that show till the end. But it was a scary proposition. But luckily, on the plus side of that, I had this divine cast of really, really funny people, clowns, and it was a Neil Simon show, and it was a dream to do. It was one of those shows that you always dream of doing, and we did it. We were pretty successful at doing it. So that ended up being a good experience.
Good.
even though it was a nightmare.
I feel like they usually are. Well, Perry, any last thoughts, things you want to say about your life, career, stage management in general?
Boy, I don't know. You have to be lucky. You have to be in the right place at the right time. Going to school and meeting people and passing the knowledge on is, for young people, there's nothing more important than giving them the opportunity that you had and making that a really satisfying, wonderful experience so they can in turn pass on all of the joy that Phil Friedman and Bob Fosse and the people at Paul Taylor and Joffrey and Crazy Agnes DeMille and all those people did for me. Do the same thing for the future. It's pass it on. The theater is a strange art form in that it's one of the few things that's done as a community, but it's handcrafted every step of the way. There's no such thing as this is how every show is its own thing. But you can learn to take what you learn from previous experiences and move it to the next level and keep moving it and keep moving it and keep learning and keep doing and just do it till you can't do it anymore. Or you're tired of it. You get old. And then you retire. But the important thing is to pass on the joy of doing it. And because I've seen a lot of stuff that's on Broadway this season. And I'm telling you, the theater we're really in somewhat of a renaissance. I think it's in much better shape than I remember the 1980s being. That's for sure. From the late 1960s, like 1968 or 9, until Pippin was an isolated experience, and then Chorus Line, and some of the Sondheim shows. Then things after Chorus Line and Dance, and things became very strange in the theater world, and then doing all the British mega musicals. It was very strange. It was weird because when you're doing stuff that's so big and so all-consuming, you look back on it with a lot of joy, but when you're doing it, it's really hard work. And to do this kind of hard work, you have to want to do the material. And there's so much that I've seen recently that's really, really good material out there. So many good young writers and so many good young composers, lyricists, choreographers. A lot of the people that I worked with on shows like Saturday Night Fever and Andy Blankenbuehler, he's a fantastic choreographer now. He was one of the guys in the company. And Casey Nicholaw, he played the father in Saturday Night Fever. And he's like the biggest thing going. He's great. And he was great back then, and he's great now. And it's like, it's a business, but it is an art form, and it's totally handmade. And people have to understand that. You have to strike that right balance of that.
All right. Well, thank you, Perry. This has been wonderful.
You're welcome.
All
Great
right.
to meet you.
Great to meet you too. All right. That is it for this week on Standing in the Dark. Thank you, everyone.